many other English musicians in the 60s and 70s, was both fascinated with and suspicious of America. The first time he traveled to New York, it was 1970. He saw the Velvet Underground for the first time, and his connection with the US really began.
We're going to America, land of subways, but you have to be a sadist or a masochist to take the subway in America. Anyway, that's where we're going, America. Land of the living, land of the dead. Land of the dead, they've got lots of murders. And that's not the only problem, you see. You've got the apartment problem as well, because you just can't get an apartment. Like somebody comes to, really sorry, I'm afraid I have some very bad news for you. Your grandmother has died. Oh, that's awful. Is her apartment gone yet? They jump in. Did she die with central heating?
The following year, he was back and he met Iggy Pop at Max's Kansas City, going on to produce the Stooges' next album, Raw Power, and later Lou Reed's Transformer. And this is why, when I get into the story of the foundations of punk rock, David Bowie has to be included in the conversation, but that's for another video. By the time he had created the Ziggy Stardust character, he was established in America, and was very influenced by his time there. In the middle of the tour for Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, Bowie recorded the follow-up, Aladdin Sane, in a couple of sessions in the US, which included the songs Panic in Detroit, in reference to the 1967 Detroit race riots, and Cracked Actor, concerning the darker side of Hollywood. David Bowie realized at this point the only way that he could force his own evolution and truly tap into his creativity, both intellectually and culturally, would be to expand his lived experience beyond the rigid streets of England. He made his first move to New York in 1974, just in time for his most elaborate tour yet, the Diamond Dogs Tour. Each song from the album by the same name was conceived of with a dramatic production of its own, with elaborate sets and costumes. This was also one of the most reckless and dangerous times in David Bowie's life, one that even he was surprised to have come out of unscathed, relatively unscathed. Later in 1974, he moved from New York to Los Angeles in an experiment in seeing if moving to the place that he hated more than anywhere else in the world would affect his songwriting at all. Bowie despised Los Angeles, finding that being there affected him in a very negative way. It was like he knew exactly what was going to happen as a result of this, but he did it anyway. The concept of the American pop culture dream was alluring to him, even if he could see right through the plastic facade.
Since you've been in America, you seem to have picked up on a lot of the themes of American music and American culture. How's that happened?
There's a fly floating around in my milk, and there's a foreign body in it, you see, and he's getting a lot of milk. It's kind of how I felt. A foreign body here, and I couldn't help but soak it up. I mean, it filled a vast expanse of my imagination. I was always pretty imaginative, and the imagination can dry up in wherever you're living in England often. I mean, if there's nothing to keep it going, it just supplied a need in me. America became a myth land for me.
And Bowie allowed his addiction to various substances overtake him, and his mental health began to spiral as a result. At one point, Bowie even insisted that the pool at the apartment building where they'd been living in Beverly Hills was haunted, calling in an actual priest to do an exorcism. He rarely slept. He survived mostly on 2% milk and red bell peppers. In the midst of all this, he became obsessed with American soul music. Until this point, the music that David Bowie created was all based in the same glam rock roots that he'd planted back with Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars a couple years earlier. His aesthetic and persona had shifted and evolved multiple times since the beginning of his career. And now it was time for him to make one of the boldest and most courageous moves yet, with the release of Young America.
Oh, I don't want the Young America.
Undeniably shedding the glam rock label and providing his innovative take on what he called plastic soul, or blue-eyed soul music. But how could this suburban English kid know anything about the Black American experience? A couple years earlier, Bowie was in New York and he was invited to a party for Stevie Wonder at a club called Genesis. One of the waitresses at the club at the time was a friend of Stevie's girlfriend named Ava Cherry. She said in a room full of people, David Bowie walked in, white as a ghost, bright red hair. You couldn't miss him. And he noticed her because she was the only black woman in the crowd with platinum blonde hair herself. himself, and so it wasn't long before they gravitated towards each other. Soon, David learned that Ava was in fact a singer, and he invited her to join his backing group for an upcoming tour of Japan, which would eventually fall through. But they kept in touch, and shortly after they met, they started seeing each other romantically. Ava took David up to Harlem, to the Apollo Theater, to introduce him to soul music the right way. They spent a lot of their time in New York hanging out in Harlem in this period, and David took in all the culture and the music like a sponge. It was here at the Apollo that David would first encounter musicians and singers who he would later feature on the Young Americans album, including Luther Vandross, who joined as backing vocalist, and the legendary Puerto Rican guitar player Carlos Alomar.
This guy, to me, was a nobody. You know, the Spiders from Mars. What the hell is a spider from Mars? I mean, that's a stupid name. No, he didn't impress me at all. I just liked him as being this English dude that was always saying, yeah, man.
When Bowie returned to the UK, Ava followed him, and he moved her into a hotel room nearby the home that he shared with his wife Angela. And when Bowie later decided to move to America, it was largely a result of her influence and his desire to dig further into American music. David and Ava continued seeing each other for 3 years, and during this time, they recorded the Young Americans album. When we talk about disco, which happened a couple of years later, the foundation of that particular brand of poppy dance music can really be traced back to Philadelphia in the late 60s to mid 70s, where a very specific genre of soul music was being produced. Philly soul was a little bit different than Motown. It was more closely related to funk than gospel or pop. It was characterized by the use of big band arrangements with lots of horns, lots of strings, and complex vocals. Think Love Train or Ain't No Stopping Us Now. This was a post-civil rights celebratory sound that echoed a feeling of abundance and freedom. Bowie went to Philadelphia in 1974 for the purpose of recording a part of his new album at the famous Sigma Sound Studio, owned by Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff, the founders of Philadelphia International Records.
Giving it, giving it, keeping it back.
Okay, that's good.
Taking you with me, loving it, right, doing it right till giving it. Giving it, keeping it back.
The title track, and what would be the first single on the album, was an Englishman's impression of what America was. It goes through different characters and the narrator's reaction to them and everything else happening around him. The lyrics are very rapid, they pile up quickly, a representation of what David Bowie felt like in America. So many things coming at him so fast. The American dream. One of Bowie's biographers said it was like America was a teenager, exploding with possibility, but with little regard for danger or propriety. The song is packed full of cultural references from both England and the US, including the one line, pointing to the Beatles' epic A Day in the Life, foreshadowing both the cover of Across the Universe, as well as a collaboration with John Lennon on what would be one of David Bowie's biggest hits. Fame was a collaboration between Bowie, John, and Carlos Alomar, who added the funk to it.
How did the involvement with David Bowie come about? Well, he sort of seems to be in New York, right? And I seem to be the guy in New York that all the Englishmen say hi to, you know. And I got to know David through Mick. And next minute he says, hello, John, I'm doing Across the Universe. Do you want to come on down? I said, all right, you know, I live here. I popped down and I played rhythm. You know. Then he had this lick, you know, we'd finished Across the Universe, and this guitarist had a lick, so we sort of wrote this song, you know. It was no big deal. We just sort of, boom, 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 you know, like that. It wasn't like sitting down to write a song, so we made this lick into a song is what happened. And that's how it happened, and there it is, yeah.
John Lennon was in New York recording his rock and roll album at the record plant when Bowie got to town and wanted to meet up. John agreed to play on Bowie's cover of Across the Universe, and they subsequently wrote Fame together.
It came out of a conversation that we had. I said, you know, I hate this manager that I've got. What can I do about it? You know, how do I get a new manager? And that's just stop right there. No management. You don't need management. I mean, he was the first artist I'd ever met who told me that I didn't need management, that it was not necessary, you know, and bless him. Hell, I mean, he was one of the major influences on my musical life. I mean, I just thought he was the very best of what could be done with rock and roll. He would take the most odd idea and make it work for the masses. And I thought that was just so admirable. I mean, that was like making artwork for the people and not sort of having it as an elitist, thing. There was just so much about him that I admired. He was tremendous,
David's concept for the song was inspired by some legal trouble that he'd been having concerning his previous manager, Tony DeFries. DeFries had started a management company called Main Man, and he negotiated the contracts for Bowie's RCA record deal so that the two of them would own their copyrights 50-50 of any of the music that they recorded during this time. This was practically unheard of at the time, and as Bowie became more famous, he also became more resentful and paranoid with his increased substance abuse, and their partnership began to dissolve. A settlement would be decided between Bowie, DeFries, and Main Man later in 1975. But the year before, when Bowie was in the studio, he was still seething. And this set the tone of the song, with the lyrics of Fame representing his resentment towards DeFries. On top of that, the song gets into his general dissatisfaction with being a famous person, contributed to by one of the most famous people in the world. Much to his surprise, Fame would go on to be David Bowie's biggest hit yet, and his first US Billboard #1. Young Americans was released with the title single in February 1975, followed by the album a few weeks later. It did better overall in the US than it did in the UK, which was kind of what Bowie was hoping for with this shift in genres. And it opened the door for a lot of other artists who were feeling pigeonholed by the rock and roll labels that were becoming more blurry at the edges with every passing year. By the time this tour had come to a close, however, Bowie's mental health was spinning out, all as a result of his ongoing substance abuse, his reckless lifestyle in Los Angeles, and he left the States by the end of 1975 to go back to Europe to continue the development of a new character that he was working on, the Thin White Duke.